You ever hear a science experiment that sounds like it was made up to scare people? Because this one sounds like a fake internet story at first. A scientist builds a perfect world for mice. Unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no bad weather, no need to search for shelter. Basically, mouse heaven. And then somehow that perfect little world destroys itself. This was not some random YouTube creepypasta. It was a real experiment connected to John B. Calhoun, a researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health. Calhoun spent years studying what happens when animals are crowded together, not starving, not hunted, not freezing, just crowded. And the most famous version of his work became known as Universe 25. Now, that name already sounds like the title of a lost sci-fi movie. But Universe 25 was not in space. It was a mouse enclosure built in Maryland in 1968. Calhoun designed it to remove almost every normal problem a mouse would face in the wild. The mice had food, they had water, they had nesting material. They had little wall-mounted spaces where they could sleep and raise young. The area was cleaned, predators were not there. Disease was monitored. The whole point was to ask a simple question. If you take away the usual causes of death, what happens next? And the answer was way darker than expected. The experiment began on July 9, 1968 with just 8 mice, 4 males and 4 females. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The mice needed time to adjust to the new place and to each other. Calhoun called this the early adjustment phase. For a little while, Universe 25 was quiet. Then the babies started coming. After about 104 days, the first litters were born. From there, the population took off. The number of mice doubled about every 55 days. 20 became 40. 40 became 80. 80 became 160. The colony was growing exactly the way you might expect in a world where food and water were always there. And this is the part where most people misunderstand the experiment. The collapse did not start because the mice ran out of food. It did not start because they ran out of water. It did not start because some predator broke in. The scary part is that the world was still working. The problem was the social world inside it. As more mice were born, the space became harder to organize. Not because every square inch was physically full, but because mouse society depends on territory, roles, mating behavior, parenting, and stable interactions. The more crowded it got, the more those patterns started to break. Around day 315, the population was over 600 mice. Growth was still happening, but it slowed down a lot. The doubling time stretched from about 55 days to around 145 days. That was the first big warning sign. The mice were not at the maximum number the enclosure could physically support. But socially, something was already going wrong. Male mice had a harder time defending territory. Some stopped trying. Some became aggressive in chaotic ways. Others withdrew. Females with young became more exposed to nest invasions. And when the normal social order broke down, parenting started to break down with it. This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Calhoun observed nursing females becoming more aggressive, not just toward intruders but sometimes toward their own young. Some young were wounded. Some were forced out before normal weaning. Some litters disappeared between surveys. Conceptions declined. Fetal loss increased. Infant survival dropped. In other words, the colony was still alive, but the behaviors needed to keep the colony going were falling apart. And then came one of the most famous parts of the experiment, the mice Calhoun called the beautiful ones. These were mostly male mice that looked physically healthy. They were not covered in wounds. Their fur stayed clean. They did not fight. They did not mate. They did not really participate in mouse society at all. They ate, drank, slept, and groomed themselves. That sounds peaceful for about 2 seconds, until you realize what it meant. They were alive, but they had stopped doing the behaviors needed for the population to continue. No courtship, no territory, no parenting, no social recovery. Universe 25 kept moving, but it was moving toward a dead end. The population peaked around 2,200 mice. That happened around day 560, and after that, growth basically stopped. A few mice born up to around day 600 survived past weaning, but after that, no young survived. The last conception happened much later, around day 920, but reproduction was already functionally finished. That is one of the most important facts in the whole story. The colony did not die because every mouse suddenly dropped dead. It died because the colony could no longer replace itself. Even when the population dropped back down, the behavior did not reset. You would think that once the crowding eased, the remaining mice might start over. But Calhoun reported that they did not rebuild the colony. The social behaviors needed for mating, parenting, and stable groups had already been damaged. By March 1, 1972, the average surviving mouse was extremely old by mouse standards. On June 22, 1972, only 122 mice were still alive. Calhoun projected that the last male would be gone by May 23, 1973. Long before the last body was gone, the population was already reproductively dead. That is why Calhoun used such a strange phrase for the paper, death squared. He was not just talking about physical death. He was talking about a first death before the second one. The first death was the loss of the behaviors that keep a society alive. The second death was the actual death of the body. Now online, people love to use this experiment as proof that modern society is doomed. They will say, this is exactly what is happening to humans. They point at cities, social media, birth rates, isolation, and loneliness. And honestly, you can see why the story grabs people. It feels like a warning. But this is where we have to be careful. Universe 25 was a mouse experiment. Mice are not humans. Human cities are not mouse boxes. People have culture, language, laws, technology, privacy, transportation, jobs, families, institutions, and the ability to redesign the environment they live in. You cannot just draw a straight line from a mouse enclosure to modern life and say, that explains everything. Even historians and researchers who take Calhoun seriously have pointed out that his work was often simplified. The popular version became crowding equals collapse, but the real lesson was more complicated. Calhoun was interested in how design, social roles, unwanted contact, and lack of control could affect behavior. That difference matters. Because if you say the lesson is just too many individuals in one place causes collapse, that is not accurate enough. Some dense human environments work very well. Some isolated people suffer badly. Density by itself is not the whole story. A better way to read Universe 25 is this. A living system can have enough physical resources and still fail if the social structure breaks down. That is the creepy part. The mice had food, but feeding was not enough. They had water, but drinking was not enough. They had shelter, but shelter was not enough. Survival was not just about keeping bodies alive. It was also about maintaining the behaviors that made the group function. And once those behaviors disappeared, the colony could not just flip a switch and return to normal. That may be the part that still feels relevant today, without pretending humans are mice. It raises a question that is a lot more interesting than, are cities bad? The real question is, what happens when a society gives people the basics but strips away healthy roles, privacy, trust, family stability, meaningful work, and real community? That is harder to answer, and it is probably why this experiment refuses to disappear. Universe 25 was not a prophecy. It was not a perfect model of humanity. It was not proof that modern life is doomed. But it was a disturbing look at how a population can collapse even when the obvious problems have been solved. Calhoun built a world where mice did not have to fear hunger, whether predators or disease. And somehow, the danger came from inside the paradise. So maybe the real horror of Universe 25 is not that the mice were trapped in a nightmare. It is that, from the outside, it looked like heaven.